Hello everybody, today on the channel, the car of your dreams, provided it's 2005 again and you're 17. This is the Vauxhall Astra VXR. The mid-2000s was a pretty great time to be a young petrolhead. Maybe it's simply because that was the time that I myself was a teenager, and we're always going to have a bit of a nostalgic association with those times in our lives. But you also had Top Gear in its revised format finally coming on song and delivering some absolutely fantastic content. And more than that, manufacturers across the globe seemed to have a range that had at least something exciting in it for people of all budgets. And there was in Britain no more hotly contested segment than that of the hot hatch. And today's star car is Vauxhall's contender in that segment. This VXR was spun off the Astra H platform that landed in 2004. It was introduced in 2005 and then finally discontinued along with the rest of the model line in 2009. The Astra came in a number of different body styles, but the one that I think most appealed to the young petrolhead was this, the 3-door GTC. Grand Touring Compact. I always thought they were actually a pretty decent looking thing, and I must confess I do have a bit of nostalgia for this model, because when it was new my dad had one as a company car, which he later sold to my sister for her to take to college and back. That was the far more company car and young person friendly 1.7 diesel, but even so, for me at the time, I thought it was a little bit interesting. A few of the things I remember include the styling, the fact that the interior even then wasn't really all that upmarket, and the indicators, which, chunky and rubbish styling aside, were memorable because they were the first time in a car I remember indicators not really wanting to move. So you flick the lever either up or down as you would in a normal item, but they then just return to where they came from and don't seem to want to cancel. I recall them being very, very frustrating. Not really that complicated, is it? But in 2005, apparently it was. In any case, the range-topping VXR had all the kit needed, not just to be a competent hot hatch, but also one that would appeal more than any of its many competitors, which at the time included the likes of the then-new Ford Focus ST, complete with amazing 2.5-litre Volvo-derived 5-cylinder engine, the Renault Sport Megane 225, that's the one with the big bum, the VW Golf GTI, which I think would have just about morphed into Mark V variant, and also the likes of the Skoda and plenty of other cars too that I have certainly forgotten. What appealed most about this, I think, was the fact that not only was it a little bit cheaper than some of its rivals, including the Renault and the VW, it was also more powerful than all of them. The Golf of the day was making 200 horsepower, the Renault 225, and even the Ford, with its larger engine, still only 225. This, meanwhile, made 240, or in brake horsepower, 237. And that counted for a lot. In terms of torque, you've got 236 pound-foot, that's 320 newton-meters. You've even got a 6-speed manual gearbox, which even in a saloon car of the day would not necessarily have been a given, and you've got the styling designed to appeal explicitly to the minds of the max power generation. So you've got more aggressive bumpers, wheels, side skirts, spoiler at the back, and my favourite touch, the centrally mounted exhaust. I like that a lot. The interior transformation was somewhat more subtle, so you have these strips of, I'm pretty sure, mock carbon. You've also got nice VXR dials, the VXR steering wheel with quite a bit of padding, a few, I think, bespoke touches, including the little VXR badge down the bottom. You've got the aforementioned 6-speed gear lever, and, most important for me, you've got these Recaro buckety seats, which I really like. They hug you nicely, they've got a fair bit of adjustment in them, though the cabin does feel quite tight. I know I always complain about my freakishly long torso, but I am only 5'10" with a tailwind, and so I would have expected this to feel a little bit roomier than it does. Particularly combined with the dark headlining, that I do quite like, it doesn't feel that roomy at all, this car. Other things to note, considering it was 2005, Vauxhall did do quite well on the technology front. There was a selection of no fewer than 3 different screens for your, computer down here, I suppose we should call it. This is the middle one. Above that, you then had a full colour display, complete with basic navigation if you spec'd it, and below a far simpler one. None of the controls or switches or dials down here feel that great, but you do have an MP3 compatible CD player. You've got air conditioning, electric windows either side, central locking of course, no heated seats or anything like that. But you could have, and this is really impressive, adaptive dampers. This car doesn't have them, and its owner James tells me that most which did now don't either, because it does break, and when it does, the sort of people that have an Astra VXR generally think that's an opportunity to replace them with coilovers, which is something he might do with this car one day, but in its present guise it is almost entirely standard. The changes that he has made thus far have mostly been in the name of reliability. So the turbo is now a hybrid, but the map is currently standard. The air intake has been rerouted. By default, apparently, they have a pipe that just goes straight over the top of the engine. So this has what I'm told is the crossover mod that eliminates that. The most important thing is that he says this car, in spite of its reputation, gives him the fizz. So, time to find out if it does the same for me. James, the owner, describes himself as a Vauxhall fan through and through. He comes from a Vauxhall family, and when he first saw the review of this pitted against the Golf GTI and the Renault Sport Megane on Top Gear all those years ago, he was smitten and decided one day he had to have it. 3 years ago, after saving up for a bit, he finally managed to make the dream reality. But I am very happy to say that James is not your typical Astra VXR owner, because though he is a young man in his 20s, it was important to him that he essentially revived this car. When he got it, it was languishing in a dealership in a bit of the country which is not particularly well known for fine examples of used cars, and it had 7 previous owners that, as far as he could see, hadn't looked after it. He has spent the last 3 years working his way through all of the car's many issues and wanted to bring it to me now while it's in still a relatively standard state, for which I am very, very grateful. Getting the chance to drive a car of this era in this condition is actually quite rare. Sure, cosmetically it's gone the typical Vauxhall pink in a few places, and there's a teeny little bit of rust poking its head through the sill. But other than that, I think it's actually presented fairly well, and it's a great opportunity to be able to experience this car essentially as Vauxhall intended. So then, what's it like? Well, it's certainly brisk enough, and I have to say, the torque steer that Clarkson made such a big deal about doesn't really seem to be all that much of a problem. It might be because in the intervening over decade and a half, tyre technology has come quite a way. Previously, this was fitted with Landsail brand tyres, but now it has Michelin Pilot Sport 5s. I've no doubt they are going to be helping quite a bit. Eventually, it will be getting a limited slip differential because James wants to take this up to about 300 horsepower. However, at present, it has the factory no limited slip diff whatsoever. Visibility, I have to say, is actually pretty good. The B pillars are chunky, but also quite far behind you. The throttle can on occasion be quite sensitive. I put the car into sport mode that sharpens it up a little bit, and I think maybe Wayton's the steering. He wasn't sure about that. He said it might do something or other. He thought it might quicken the rack, but I don't think that seems very likely. In any case, said steering is very, very light, and though you do sense the odd bit of torque steer, it really isn't getting in the way of enjoying the car at all. Curiously, though Top Gear the TV programme said that it was a really big issue, Top Gear the magazine said that it actually wasn't at all. Evil, I'm told, said the same thing. This car's successor, the even shapelier Astra J, then got an even fancier front suspension, a Hyperstrut layout to cope with its 280 or 290 horsepower. I actually also have got a real thing for those. I think they're a genuinely good-looking car. I'm actually genuinely sad what's happened to Vauxhall of late. Their acquisition by Stellantis, I don't think has really done them any favours. The new Mokka, a lot of people really seem to like, but in terms of styling, I mean, just doesn't look like a Vauxhall to me. I suppose some people would consider that a good thing. Of course, on the continent, these were not Vauxhall Astra VXRs. They were still Astras, but sold under the Opel brand, and the VXR variant was labelled as the OPC. At the national speed limit, you can have quite a bit of fun. The car turns in actually relatively keenly, and though you can tell that the suspension isn't set up to be the stiffest, it will still get you round a bend, although with a fair bit of body roll accompanying it. This actually, to me, does make the whole thing just that little bit more entertaining and does help communicate to you exactly how much you're asking of the chassis. The engine is pretty decent, and the power delivery is actually fairly linear. It doesn't pull massively hard, but then I suppose, by modern standards, they are relatively modest numbers. Every now and again, I have just got a little bit of judder through this wheel. Feels like it's actually trying to lift a wheel up. Something untoward, I think, is going on there. Maybe a bushing or something needs a little bit of TLC, but that's only a couple of moments it's done that. The overall refinement would be, I would say, fairly good for a car in this class if it weren't for the fact that a previous owner has had the door cards off and not properly reattached them, so it's currently rattling in stereo. On the motorway, the car will do apparently about 42 the gallon, but over a shorter distance it's averaged 33, which I would say for a performance car is not that bad. The brakes are decent enough. There's a fair bit of gap though between that pedal and the throttle, meaning that if you've got smaller feet, heel and toe can be an issue. Rev matching is relatively easy, and heel toe can be done, but it's a bit of effort. I know James said that he does struggle with that. The brake pedal doesn't give you masses of feedback, but actually it's got more travel than some others, meaning you can modulate it fairly nicely. The steering, meanwhile, is not the most feelsome, but does give you a lot more than you get from many a modern-day rack, partly on account of the fact it's hydraulic. In the wet, I do suspect that it may still be something of a handful, and that was always going to be the case. This much power and no limited slip diff. But you could also say that of modern-day Civic Type R. It is that element of what I suppose some would consider unpredictability and others excitement that makes it so appealing to the kind of people that bought them. Okay, first does give you a bit of torque steer still, but you know what? I've had much worse. Perhaps the most frustrating thing is that if you've reached that age where you're either considering a trip back down memory lane, or, like James, you've always wanted a car from this era and now find yourself in the position where you can have one, the thing getting in your way of the Vauxhall is sadly rather predictable. That is its build quality. In truth, in terms of its interior, it's probably no better or worse screwed together than the Ford of the time, but the Ford just felt, I think, a little bit more cohesive and perhaps a touch more modern. Maybe that's my memory playing tricks on me. It has been forever since I've driven a Mark II Focus of any description. If someone happens to have a Mark II Focus RS, I'd really, really like a go of one of those, because to me that's got to be a modern classic. Rattling aside, that I think isn't this car's fault, it has also worn rather badly in places, with the steering wheel looking like it's been in a fire. The surround for the gear lever, meanwhile, looks like it's been in some sort of fight, and I'm really not quite sure what's happened there. But these are things I think that can be easily ignored. Less so are the issues the car has with both engine and gearbox. Unlike its baby brother, the Corsa VXR, these don't have a reputation for their engines letting go, but elements of them can be a little bit iffy, including the valve stem seals, which on this car I think is beginning to become a problem. It's begun drinking, and on the way past when doing the drive-bys, I could smell it. The turbo has also been replaced because, again, that was firing out far too much oil and in the process did some damage to the intercooler. Happily, when it came to replacing the intercooler, James has again exercised unusual maturity for your Astra VXR owner by not going for the nice big obvious silver one and instead a far more subtle black item. Clutch is fairly nice. The clutch is Okay, the clutch is easy to modulate, but the throttle when pulling away on occasion can be horrible, and you can see that the gearbox mounts or something have gone wrong, because when you accelerate, the lever moves around a lot. Speaking of which, it is the gearbox that is considered by many to be the Achilles heel of this car and just about everything else that had the M32 in it. which includes a whole bunch of Alfa Romeos of the era, including, I think, the Brera that I had, and maybe even my 147 too. It's chocolate. I mean, really, really poor. To underline just how bad it is we're talking about here, those gearboxes can get broken by a Corsa VXR on standard power. Yeah. So by the time you've got people running one of these and then modifying it and putting 300 horses and a lot more torque through it, they don't last that long at all. Of course, they can be replaced, but ultimately they will just fail again. How much then today are you going to pay for one of these? Well, that seems to be a little bit tricky to find out. There were a couple of examples at about the £3,000 mark, but that seems to be your entry point for the model, and therefore likely means a car that's going to need something spent on it, possibly quite quickly. Later, facelifted models, which were introduced in 2007, including the likes of the Nürburgring edition, can command quite a bit more, up to, it would appear, about £10,000 for a good low mileage one. I think I would struggle to spend that amount of money on a 15-year-old Astra, but each to their own. It is really heartwarming to see people like James deciding to take the time and effort necessary to preserve cars like this, because simply put, not many other people will. Frustratingly, when they did introduce that facelift in 2007, they introduced some different colours for the car as well, including a new shade of red replacing this, which is called Flame, with a new one called Power. The big difference being the fact that the new Power Red doesn't fade like this and every other old red Vauxhall did. The odd pop, squeal and chirp out of the car will certainly appeal to its target demographic, though I have to say the standard exhaust just doesn't sound that great. Apparently for later cars, a Remus sports exhaust was offered, and that was from the era when a sports exhaust really was a different exhaust that would have made quite an impact. For this, though, I'm told this was essentially all you were going to get, and therefore a lot of owners are tempted to put something on that in many cases is just far too fruity. Anyway, second attempt at some fun road. Yeah, actually holds on pretty well, you know. I think these PS5s have probably done the car a real favour. I'm told it was quite a handful before. The gearbox, actually, though you can't rush it too quickly, is better again than James really gave it credit for. And I have to say, I'm quite enjoying this car. You know, it's unleashing the inner hooligan. You look down to and you're doing, just about the right speed. Though, of course, any sort of modern proper hot hatch, and to say nothing of the likes of an A45 or Golf R, would show this a clean pair of heels. But in its day, it was a serious performer, and even now, actually, once you've got it on song, it's not slow. James pointed out a Civic EP3 as we were out driving earlier, and the fact is, compared with that, the Honda's probably the better overall ownership proposition, provided you get a good one, and actually, the worst examples of those, I think, could be worse than the bad ones of these. But with that peppy little VTEC engine, it's a much harder car to keep on song and maintain your speed. This, you can do sort of 3,000 to 4,000 RPM, and it feels like the engine is in its happy place. It's much easier to make good progress here. Yeah, heel and toe can definitely be done. And I've got to say, I like the fact too that when you spot one of these, you just know that's an Astra. And usually you can tell if it's a VXR as well. I'm actually really, really enjoying this. I know it's not the sort of car that people tend to associate me with driving, but this is the sort of car that I grew up with, and I've always had a bit of a thing for them. Yeah, sure, look, the interior is just naff. It is. Other than the seats. Love them. But you know something? This is James's dream car. For 2 years, he ran it alongside a Punto, which was, in theory, his daily, but then did a little bit of maths and realised that actually running the two cars was definitely not saving him money. So this is now his daily and his dream car. And you know what? I'm really, really glad to see that he's also looking after it and doing everything that he can to bring it back to its former glory and enjoy it in a way that I think its makers would be proud of. I just really, really hope he tends to these door cards sooner rather than later. So then, that's my take on the Vauxhall Astra VXR. A big thank you to James for bringing it out, and as ever, to you for watching. Have you got an iconic 90s or noughties hot hatch you'd like to see on the channel? Don't forget to get in touch. But in any case, I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.